here's a pastor saying he wants to absolutely torch white evangelicals. Well, one, we are evangelicals. We believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that needs to be addressed, because here's somebody from our own body wanting to torture people in the body. That is sadistic, and that needs to be addressed. Not just, oh man, how do we calm him down for a little bit? That's one of those things of, I can only imagine what the Apostle Paul would write.
Welcome to today's Pastor's Roundtable. Today we have a special guest with us. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but first, let's find out about the two pastors who are with us today. Jim, introduce yourself.
I'm Jim Bohr. I pastor a church in Brownsburg, just outside of Indianapolis.
My name's Bert Spann. I'm the pastor of First Baptist Church in Hohenwald, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville.
And I'm Bobby Gilstrap, founder of Dynamic Church Ministries and a consultant working across the country as well. Now, today we have with us a special guest. We have Sal Cordova, who is with us, and he is a member of McLean Bible Church in Virginia. So, Sal, we are so glad to have you joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I am a member there. I also am a volunteer in the leadership team of the Apologetics Ministry. That's partly because my professional work as a molecular biophysics researcher is connected to apologetics. I was actually professionally hired to do research in the area of apologetics as it relates to biology and physics.
There's a lot of things that are happening at McLean right now, and that would be an understatement, I think you could say. We've been talking about leadership in larger churches, and particularly the mega church and the differences in that. With all the things that are going on there at McLean, it's been in the news, both religious news and secular news, about a lot of things that are happening. And Sal, one of the ways you and I connected was because of your real concern about what you saw as a doctrinal drift. We've had all kinds of issues with woke theology and a lot of other things that we've seen just across the country here in recent days. But because of your focus on just as your organization called evidence and reasons, your focus on doctrine was really important. So tell us a little bit about your story and what you see happening at McLean. And then we want to ask some questions, find out a little bit more about what's happening, and maybe even give some encouragement.
Sure. Well, actually, I have to confess, I'm not very doctrinarian. I mean, it's important to me, but so when something comes up on my radar, it has to be pretty egregious. As
right.
I
In other words, you're not a theologian as such.
No, I'm not a theologian. I'm a science researcher, and I focus on giving evidences for the Christian faith through science, that's a whole nother story. But perhaps to summarize this, one of the pastors, he's second in line behind David Platt at McLean Bible. Someone alerted me to a recording where he said, when he's commenting on the Trayvon Martin and then the George Floyd thing last year, he said, sometimes I find it difficult not to torch all white people, especially white evangelicals and Christians. Now, this quote had been circulating. It's been public knowledge that he did this in an interview. It was sent to the leadership and nothing was done about it. In fact, he got promoted. And there are pictures of him holding these Black Lives Matter to God signs, helping little kids hold it up. Right around the time we were seeing the cities actually getting torched, and the looting and just the violence going on. So rather than preaching against all the looting and violence and the senselessness, he starts preaching on May 17, 2020 about demanding racial justice. Didn't really specify what that meant, insinuating that a lot of people that are white in the congregation are guilty. They have to repent of it. People started leaving that very day. It was well known that May 17th of 2020, he gave a sermon with David Platt. The pastor's name is Mike Kelsey. And people that very day started submitting their resignations. because they felt that was it was racist against those who were light-skinned in the congregation. They felt that this was divisive. And just to give an idea, I have the official church report. The attendance April 2020 was 18,974. The latest figure now is 7,509. And so what upset me apparently upset a lot of the longtime members. And by the way, I'm officially a member only like the last 2 years because I was in leadership, appointed to leadership in the Apologetics Ministry team. But I had been on and off at McLean for almost 40 years. And I've seen, I've seen how the church has grown from like 300 to that figure of almost 20,000 in that time. But then I've also seen it get cut in half in just 1 year. So that's kind of a reflection of, if I had to say a doctrinal concern, it's also expressed by the congregation rejecting it, which I thank God for, because it's like they had discernment. They didn't like this. They felt that even though a lot of the gospel was being taught, there was poison being added to it. And they said, we don't want that.
How did that impact all the different age groups? I mean, obviously, if families are leaving it at that kind of a rate, then that had to have an impact. And well, that's one question, guys. I'm going to stop interrupting, let you guys jump in here in a second. But I just got to thinking about the membership issue. Are there any obligations, any kind of special commitment that is expected of those who come into membership, and particularly in leadership, that lines up with the doctrine and what you now see as some of the doctrinal concerns?
Well, for me, it's just like, well, the Bible is always our guideline. That's just a given. And so the main concern was Mike Kelsey was talking about all these atrocities in the Civil War era. And there are a lot of people that are light-skinned that came from Eastern Europe long after that. And, because we have diplomats that used to come to our church. How are they guilty? Why is it in the eyes of our pastor that, when George Floyd is, what happened to him, does it inspire kind of this very negative view of people in his own congregation just because they're light skinned? That was like, you don't blame someone for crimes they're not guilty of. That is so basic. I don't think it even needs to be in the church constitution or anything. And so people were just leaving over that because they saw that this is just so wrong to impute sins to one group of people for things that they never did.
How long has he been a pastor at the church?
I really don't know. He came up from the junior ranks, so I'd say around at least 10 years. And so what's happening is a lot of pastors that we would have thought had very conservative views, it's only because of the current political climate and then what you're hearing in the news, they seemed like, oh, this seems like, I'm just speculating here. It's like, oh, now this is a fad. We can jump on board with it and start saying, okay, we're trying to defend justice. Because even David Platt, when he was at McLean in 2017, his sermons were very, very conservative. And then in 2020, with the eruption of the Black Lives Movement, that suddenly started to be kind of the topic, maybe not explicitly, but it started talking about, the need for social or racial reconciliation. And so it's good that you ask how long this person had been in the church. And so if he was harboring these views, he'd kept them pretty quiet up until it started to be kind of mainstream, so to speak, in the secular culture.
So fight injustice with more injustice, fight racism with racism. And it comes from white fragility, where you had a white woman, a privileged white woman, telling African Americans especially how to have agency. And I thought that was so odd to me, that you had to have a white person tell people of a darker skin color, how they can have agency, and it needs that white person to again speak for them, rather than coming to the table, saying the Constitution, like Frederick Douglass said, that we need to claim those truths, and the Bible. We need to claim the truth that we're one body in Christ, not different ethnicities. We're all one now. No longer male, female, no Jew, Greek, no more. That's not the message of white fragility. The message for white fragility is racism. And rather than saying racism is bad, like back in the 60s, and look at people's character, we're going back. We're going back and flipping injustice upside down. It's heartbreaking.
Yes, and what was disturbing though is even prior to this, on the college campuses and the campus ministries, I was seeing the call for social justice. And I was very upset about that. It's the first problem is, how do you define what justice is? Is it unjust that one demographic group in general has less prosperity than another demographic group? And you could say, well, it's sad that one demographic group is impoverished. It doesn't necessarily mean that the primary cause of that is racism in the present day. So me being Asian American, I can tell you that Asians have been overrepresented in the universities, but it's attributable. If you're anyone who's been raised in an Asian family, it's like the emphasis on academics is just
right
through the roof. I remember a Chinese woman practically scolding her daughter that she wouldn't accept anything less than her daughter being valedictorian at the high school. It's like, you're a failure if you don't. It's
right.
That sort of pressure. I mean, that causes problems in the Asian community, but we can't just say that the reasons Asians are overrepresented in universities because of racism. The economist Thomas Sowell had seen that this plays out, they're cultural forces. And so Mike Kelsey not defining what justice is, it's just all this ambiguity and just rage against everything. And I'm just like, you have to think through this. Because the first thing I would have asked him if this were a congregational meeting, I said, okay, are you in favor of quotas and affirmative action? And that would have told me what his definition of justice is. And if it is this idea of Marxism where we have all equal outcomes and we're just leveraging covetousness between people, and the Lord said, do not covet. I said, then this isn't the gospel. But we haven't even had the chance. And what happened was there were Sunday schools that were then taught after this sermon. And so that was largely attended at first, but then huge numbers left the Sunday school after the first session. They said, this isn't the gospel. When I got a hold of that quote where Mike Kelsey was saying, he finds it difficult not to torch all white people, especially white evangelicals and Christians. I said, where is your heart? Where is your heart that you're fomenting so much rage against innocent people? I said, I appreciate his honesty that he's confessing what's wrong in his heart, but it's like, if he's trying to lead racial reconciliation in his church, I don't think having an attitude like that is helpful, and it expresses itself in his sermons.
How has this played out in the halls and in the classrooms at church, and just even conversations around the restrooms or the lobby of those of different ethnicities? How has that meeting where he came out and he said these things affected the life of the church with different ethnic groups within the body?
A lot of the ethnic groups were offended. I can say that even African Americans were embarrassed. Some of them that have seen my videos said they're really upset with Mike Kelsey for saying that this is not the love of Jesus Christ. And I can understand that, because some of these people, their best friends in church are not the same. We were probably one of the most diverse congregations in the United States. Because we're in the Washington, D.C. area, we have people from all ethnicities. We had probably 100 ethnicities represented in our church.
I visited McLean when I was with my kids, like about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And it was a day you guys celebrated all of your connections. There's actually a church you guys working with in I think it was Africa. And you had like a multi-ethnic worship service where different ethnicities were represented, and all the people there were just is a variegated group of people, all different shapes and sizes that day. I was amazed that this is one of the most ethnically diverse places I've been in my life, besides being in New York metro area. And I was just amazed at it. And it was a beautiful ceremony. And that's the only thing I knew about that church at the time.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I wasn't there that day when they had that multi-ethnic service, but you see, this was an insult to a lot of the people there that are of white ethnicity, if I may say that, who had worked so hard to make this a welcoming place. And then from the pulpit kind of being insinuated, you guys are not making the other ethnicities feel welcome. I'm just like, I didn't feel that way. And I didn't see that. I didn't hear any complaints. The irony is where this complaint of white privilege and whites being oppressive, it's coming from kind of the light-skinned people. It's not coming from the other ethnicities, just like what you would see some of the people leading the charge for the Black Lives, or let's say more Antifa, are light-skinned people. It's not the people that they claim who are actually being oppressed.
Did you see or feel like there was some kind of shift as far as doctrine or theology at all when Dr. Platt came and united with the church as far as becoming the lead pastor at that point?
No, not at all. Not at all. The first 2 years, I said, this guy has wonderful sermons. And so I feel a little bit reluctant when people say that David Platt's preaching a false gospel. It's like, it's more accurate to say he's preaching the true gospel and then puts an add-on. Therefore, you do make it a false gospel, but people don't see that because for the most part, he'll just, so many of his sermons are just so perfect. And so many of the things that he teaches are extremely valuable, but you add that little bit of poison. And the fact that he was involved in promoting Mike Kelsey after this racial reconciliation initiative.
Well,
I said, okay, that's where his heart is.
I know that I remember seeing, and there's so many things that you've seen circulating online, but where Platt, has preached some messages where he addressed that. And I think you just kind of alluded to that some and addressed the issues of white privilege and some of those other things that are all a part of that kind of a woke movement. After all this starts coming out about Kelsey, as far as Pastor Kelsey, did the elder board, did Pastor Platt, did any of them, could you see any evidence of them trying to negate that at that point, or was there just seemed to be a fear of retribution, a fear of people acting out against that, since there was such a societal drift in that direction?
Yeah, I can't actually say. It's still a mystery why the governing elders, so the pastors technically are supposed to be under the direction of the elders, but the elders are all volunteers, and there were only like 6 managing a congregation of 18,000. And so it's like, okay, some of them are medical, are like dental surgeons, very busy people. And I can understand it. It's like, okay, if the pastors under you said, well, take care of it, it's like, okay, we trust you, deal with it, because their days are full. They have families of their own. And so I could see that. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that probably all this started because it's like they just didn't have time to really scrutinize what's going on. And that the prior pastor had handled things so well. The church grew from 300 to 18,000. And he was just, he was a very, very beloved, and he seemed to have, man of such integrity, handled things, didn't have to worry about any shenanigans. And so when the new guy came on board, they were treating him kind of the same way. And it's like, you just don't know what you're dealing with. So the first 2 years, it seemed rather quiet, but then we started to see the ministries disappear, and we couldn't explain it. And all this happens very slowly, just like the frog in you put it in a pot of water and you just turn up the heat slowly, he won't realize that this is
Right.
happening. Now, some discerning people like Bodhi Bakum and others had seen that there were signs that that this wouldn't go well. And when they reported that they were concerned, I'm like, oh, you're just being too persnickety. You're straining at gnats. That's not a big, even I felt that, but it's only when it gets so bad that you realize, oh my goodness, now it does make sense. The Lord did send us some discerning voices and we didn't pay attention.
The kind of leadership and the kind of model and the kind of connections that happen in a large church like McLean is very different than the majority of churches across the country. But I think there's some lessons to be learned here relative to the shift in theology, the shift in the doctrine, some of those kind of things, especially related to the culture that we're living in. Jim and Bert, could you guys kind of speak to Sal as if he were the whole congregation of McLean as such? How would you encourage them as far as alertness, being aware of what's happening? Just any kind of encouragement that you might give to that congregation about what's happening, and possibly even some steps that would help them as far as moving forward.
I think they got to start majoring on the majors. I think Elmer Towns said to me one time, he said, the methods are many, principles are few. Methods may change, principles never do. And what it sounds like is going on at McLean right now is that things that are tertiary in our minds are primary in some of the leadership that has kind of gotten power. And also, I mean, if I understand correctly, your church is a congregational church, or was. I just don't like elder rule because of the problems you mentioned there. The people are busy. They don't have time to really scrutinize things. But when you let the whole church speak, and there has to be votes, and people know their rights as a member of Christ's body, that you're there to encourage, exhort as a body, not just have one person determining all absolute truth and non-truth, who's in, who's out. You're really getting into more of a dictatorship. And again, pride goes before a fall. And when you amass that much power to one person, very few men, very few women can handle the weight of that much power without believing their own press. Christianity Today has a whole podcast right now about the rise and fall of Mars Hill. And that's a great podcast to listen to. Now, Mark Driscoll, he was a little bit more edgy than most pastors were, but it's the same pattern of abrogating all this power to yourself, thinking that your doctrine, your interpretation of every passage is the interpretation. And it's just not right. You got to be careful of thinking that. So
I don't necessarily have as big of an issue with the way that your church has chosen to use elders. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is, one, you've got too few elders for such a large congregation. And mm-hmm. two, you really do need some men who are retired, who can give time and attention to some of those issues without having kids at home where they're having to come back for meetings and so forth, and careers to deal with. But again, I think some of those are just practical things. All I can do is you're talking, I can hear Moses's father-in-law say, listen, man, you're trying to do way too much on your own. You got to spread this out some. And that was such great wisdom. And I would say some of those elders need to just start spreading some of that responsibility out, saying, listen, there's too few of us, too little time. We've got to spread some of this out. And in spreading that out, I honestly think that with the pastoral staff, that they've got to work honestly with the pastoral staff and saying, listen, guys, here's the numbers. We've lost 11,000 people in a year or a few years. Something's got to give, because a couple of years ago, we were healthy. Now it seems like everything's blowing up. If you're not careful, you're going to be like a good chunk of churches in this country where you've got a facility that'll hold 1,000, but you've only got 36 people in the worship center on Sunday mornings. If you're not careful, I would hate to see your church get to that point where you're thinking, man, we have just absolutely let this thing die.
Mars Hill exploded. Remember, it's totally gone. That
Wow.
10,000 people. There's no campus, no church anymore. It just disintegrated after the whole blow up.
And their satellites, initially they tried to separate each satellite, help them stand on their own, that kind of thing. But they all ended up disintegrating.
Because they're built upon a personality. And Bert, you and I, I think we agree. Because my point was, when you have elder rule, it's just a handful of people that make all the decisions without the congregation at all. That's where it gets problematic to me. That becomes like the Pope again. The Pope, and you have edicts, and you have papal bulls. Well, again, you need the congregation involved as well. You need to have Exodus 18, the people elected, choose among you, have people choose.
People. Oh, yeah.
And so it's not just one group of people, self-selecting from the pastor and growing. The church affirms it. And we're a body. We're not just one head telling everybody what to do. It's the whole body. And that's what you see happen there at McLean. There's not the body involvement the way it was before. Very few elders, one, staff. And so it's very limited people making a lot of decisions that impact 18,000 people, actually probably 36 to 40,000, because the people you're impacting is probably double what you had attending.
Right. And my guess is this is just a guess, Sal, but I'm guessing some people are saying, hey, let's not get into all this mess, because we just want to love. We want to be one community.
Right.
I don't think you can have love without truth. I don't. I've seen too many kids whose parents want to be buddy, and they don't discipline their children. No, they don't tell their children the truth. And the next thing you know, you got a kid that's growing up and he's an absolute terror. Well, that would be loving your child inappropriately because you didn't introduce truth and discipline into the process. I think if you love a church, you have to bring truth up. You have to bring to the forefront. Here's a pastor saying he wants to absolutely torch white evangelicals. Well, one, we are evangelicals. We believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that needs to be addressed, because here's somebody from our own body wanting to torture people in the body. That is sadistic, and that needs to be addressed. Not just, oh man, how do we calm him down for a little bit? That's one of those things of, I can only imagine what the Apostle Paul would write.
Well, Bert, and you bring up a good kind of a segue there a little bit, because if you're talking about power, position, all that kind of thing, it's very different in a very large church. The dynamics are more in smaller churches, because a lot of times smaller churches have a lot of family relationships and that kind of thing. And obviously, if there's 25 people that are all related in a church of 100, that's a larger percentage. I'm tired, I guess. That's a larger percentage of people versus a church that was running 18,000. But here's what I'm thinking in the transition of that. The leadership styles are significantly different. And Bert, you hit on something very important. People want to trust those in leadership. And I don't think that's different between a large church or a small church. They want to trust those in leadership. They want to have faith in those in leadership, that they're leading them the right direction. And it's really hard to convince people in your local church, at least to start with, at least initially, that person that they've held up as a godly leader in their church, that their church has called, that person is corrupt, that person is more driven by power, that person is more driven by greed or something else, and that their intent and their motivations are not for the best of the church, but more for their own profit, for their own benefit. And I think that's can be characteristic of a pastor in any church of any size at that point. That's kind of why I ask a little bit about if there was any kind of a shift when David Platt came, because that could have been a little bit of a clue. But it sounds like he tried to stay very doctrinally sound and stuff initially at that point.
I mean, Sal didn't say any of those things about him being, driven by money.
Right.
But why do we behave the way we behave sometimes? So obviously, you can believe you're doing the right thing. You can believe you're going the right direction, but you might be afraid of pushback. So rather than being upfront and honest because you have a great plan and you just want to change it subtly and behind the scenes because David thinks he can do this great thing and reach the nations for Christ, but the people aren't mature enough. That's a key word. Rather than saying, hey, it's my job as leadership to teach and to train and to cast a vision, and it may take longer than 2 years. It may take me 5 years, and I don't have patience for that. In my church, there's something I want to do for 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet, and it's caused stress and strain. But I didn't push as hard as I could have, because I could see if I pushed hard and went through with it, I would have put the church in structural stress, financial stress, and I wasn't willing to just break apart the church just for that one goal. Even though I think it's very needed and godly thing, and it may be somebody else beyond me doing that. When you have to take the long view, and perhaps when you get large church like that, you want to run that football 100 yards one time and get to touchdown. I would give David Platt the benefit of the doubt, because he realized from a mission heart, he wants to teach people the Bible, but he lost the focus of, I've got to bring the church along, that the church that I came to, the church I was called to, it's my job to shepherd them and bring them along, as opposed to lead like the president of IMB or lead like a professor who sets the agenda and everybody has got to follow it. I've got to sell my agenda. I've got to win people to my agenda, and it may take longer. It sounds like he's passing by the Constitution or the bylaws and passing the congregation by in this long Hail Mary pass to get whatever it is he wants to do. That's what it sounds like to me, not some sort of paragraph for him. I don't think he's that type of guy. He may be, but it just sounds more like the power and not considering the overall goal of the pastor.
Well, what I have thought about regarding this is the lesson we have from the Old Testament and the kings of Judah. So many times they started out right, and then they just went down the wrong path. I'm just like, it sounded so good. I remember just reading the passages of these various kings. It's like, I hope you have a happy ending. It's like, no, they messed up at the end.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I don't think any of this was necessarily premeditated.
Right.
This being sinister.
Manasseh came back, remember?
Yeah, and Sal, kind of what I think about, I've worked with church planters for years and years and years, and of course worked with a lot of pastors as well. And I've always, there's no organization, especially churches, that is immune to change. Change is going to happen. But the way to change a new church is very different than changing an established church. Yeah. And a new church, I always liken it to being like a speedboat. And you're going down the river, and of course you can look at the Potomac or somewhere that's near you guys there, and you're going down that in a speedboat, and you go, hey man, we need to make a change, and boy, you can turn that thing and throttle down and just take off. I mean, you're turning it on a dime, But if you are in a large ship, if you're in a big cruise ship or a big cargo ship, if we're likening it to a church, maybe it's more like a cargo and not a cruise. But you take that big old huge, they can't turn around in that little small area that you have in a river. They're going to have to get out into open water. And once they get out in open water, it's a slow, meticulous turn, slow before they can turn around and change direction and go back the other way. So in the mega church, that is so true. And I think oftentimes the power that seems to come with that position and the impatience, Jim has just mentioned that impatience. We're trying to make changes more like a speedboat than we are that huge cargo ship or that big barge of some sort at that point. Guys, for our Pastors Roundtable, we're going to wrap it up for now. We're glad that you joined us and hope you'll tune back in again sometime soon.